What?
Yes, I did. Yes. I'm getting better at it, okay?
She's ready. Okay, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome to United Israel World Union. This is our Sabbath morning study. It is a story. It's a story time. But this is our Sabbath morning study, and I appreciate you joining with us this morning. I did want to announce first off that I have a new self-titled secretary, John. There were some jokes around before we went live, and they said Bridget has nothing to worry about, and neither does Lyndon by that, as far as that goes, about running off with you've heard of people who run off with the church secretary. So John and I are not going to do that. So, but anyway, John's going to be working with us some up here at the center. I put this in the bulletin, but just so you know, he is semi-retired, meaning that he's worked for many years in industry, and now he sometimes will, as he chooses and as he needs to do this, he'll work as a consultant and so forth, and he's very much needed, but he's very much appreciated here. Might not be appreciated in other places, John. But John and Lyndon have been with us for quite some time now. I've known them for many years. They've been very helpful with the center here. And one of the things that we're doing is we are installing a phone and an answering service up here at the building, which we think is going to be a really good deal because sometimes people just want to reach out and talk to us, and one of us or both of us can accept those phone calls and answer questions and that sort of thing. So we're looking forward to that. Hopefully that will go into effect next week. But we're going to be jumping and running here. We've got a lot going on. We've got a new Wi-Fi system that we're going to attempt to try here, which we hope will be a better experience for our listeners and viewers out there across the world. The good thing is we're being smart about it. We're not canceling our other system until we validate and we prove it through a series of tests and trials, and once we do that, we may have to pay twice what we pay, for a couple of goes at it. But then after that, we hopefully will make some good progress on that. So be patient with us. We're doing everything we can in this small town in which we live. It's the best we got, and you can't hardly go wrong if you're giving God everything that you have to give, and that's what we're trying with. So one other thing I'd like to say in the form of an announcement is last night I attended, and Erin and Jamie and the kids, her family, attended an event at Chabad in Baton Rouge. We've really begun to develop a good relationship with the Chabad here in Baton Rouge. I love this young couple, the rabbi and his wife. They are very, very much trying to reach the Jewish world with a message of Torah. And they're very open and inviting, and they accept non-Jews. And so last night, one of their daughters turned 3 years old. And there is a tradition that when a girl turns 3 in the Jewish community, that's when she begins to learn to light the Sabbath candles. So this was her first Sabbath candle lighting, and we were able to attend, and it was quite beautiful. And they really did a great job. So I see us working closer together with the Jewish community, which is something that I think is beneficial for both of us. In fact, I've been asked to MC the annual lighting of the Hanukkah at the state capitol this year. So I'll let you know more about that. But on December the 16th, here in Louisiana at the state capitol, yours truly will be emceeing that festivity there. And so I'm looking forward to that. But again, it shows that what United Israel is really about is bringing together the disconnected, if you will. Within what I would call the larger Torah faith movement, we have people who are all along the spectrum. You have people who are within what some might call Messianic or Hebrew roots or whatever. You have some who would sort of lean towards what you might call B'nai Noah. Reform Judaism and so forth, all the way up to the ultra-Orthodox. And I think that if we could, as a people, now I know this is crazy, but if we could take a deep breath and allow God to be God and recognize that within this larger movement, if we can call it a movement, that there's an unseen hand that's guiding. And it doesn't need me or you, quite frankly, to be so dogged hard on people. If we can come together, where we can come together and we can unite around God, Torah, Israel, things of that nature, I think it moves the game. It advances the game, and that's what I'm about, because we should all be inclined to move the needle. The more people that become aware of Torah faith, the better world in which we live. All right? So, having said that and announced all these wonderful things, today we will be covering another section from the Joseph saga. And I believe that it's at this point in the story that things get really interesting, that things begin to pick up, that things begin to take on a different element, if you will. And I believe it points even more readily towards not only understanding the history of these events, but I believe that it points towards the prophetic, and I think we're going to be able to get into some of that today. Now, what I'd like to do is begin by covering a few points about the story. If we were to talk about this particular story, which covers Genesis chapter 41, verse 38, through chapter 42, verse 17. So we're in roughly about a chapter's worth, but you notice the breaks aren't necessarily according to what you might find in your standard English Bible. You would expect one to cover chapter 41 and then chapter 42. But anciently, as we've pointed out quite often, they follow these ancient white spaces. And this narrative that I'm going to cover today begins in chapter 41, verse 38. According to the oldest Hebrew Bible that we have, there's a white space there. And then we'll go until the next white space in chapter 42, verse 17. So here's what it's about. If you just back up before we dig in and you look at the narrative, Joseph, having interpreted Pharaoh's dreams in the previous, sets the stage for today. He makes a proposal that will guide not only the people of Egypt, but ultimately save the entire world. I mean, this is a big deal. So he not only interprets the dream, but he provides a solution for the problems which the dreams reveal. We recall that the dreams are telling us that a great famine is coming, and that in order to survive the famine, there will be, first of all, 7 years of plenty. But these years of plenty will be almost overshadowed by the horror of the drought and the famine. So what Joseph tells the Pharaoh and the Egyptian court is that we have to be prepared. We have to set aside food during the years of plenty to help us get through those. Remember, that's how we ended last week. Now, the plan seems good to Pharaoh and to all of Egypt, according to what we read. So this was a good plan. Joseph, as a result, in this week's reading, is exalted. We're going to talk a little bit about that, what it means in the story, in the narrative, as well as what it might mean prophetically. Not only is he exalted, but he's given a beautiful pagan wife. Thank you very much. We're going to talk about his wife, Asnat, who happens to be the daughter of the priest of On. Now, a lot of people will try to make her, well, she's really not an Egyptian because then the kids wouldn't be Jewish. Well, sorry, that's not in the text. We're going to go with the Bible, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. Not only does he get this probably beautiful pagan priestess, or daughter of a priest at least, to be his wife, he has 2 children, 2 sons, which are very significant in the unfolding prophetic plan, by the way, Manasseh and Ephraim. Each time when we're introduced to the next major players, we tend to point that out. So that's what we're going to do today. Now, according to the reading today, Joseph and company have and will have successfully navigated through the 7 years of plenty. And then the famine strikes. Jacob hears that there is food in Egypt. So he sends all but little Benji. He doesn't send Benjamin. He keeps him at home. He sends the other boys, 10 in number, to Egypt to get food. And guess who they have to go to? All right, well, we're going to talk about that because Jacob, when he sends the boys, he doesn't know that Joseph is even alive, nor do the boys as far as that is concerned. Now, Joseph recognizes his brothers, but they don't recognize him. I'm going to show you that this, I believe, is not only prophetic, but I believe that it provides us with a clue as to our behavior today for those of you who think you might be Joseph. There's a clue in today's story. Our story ends today with Joseph accusing the 10 of being spies, or as the Hebrew literally says, you guys that are on foot. In other words, you're walking around, checking things out. So he says that you're spies, and he locks all of them up in jail. Our story ends with all of Israel, with the exception of Joseph and Benjamin, in prison. And then we have to wait until next week. Now, I'm not going to leave you hanging. We're going to go into more detail. So we're going to read it in just a few minutes. Now, here are a couple of things to pay attention to. In this particular reading, as I said, I believe that if we have eyes to see, we begin, in my opinion, to envision the prophetic picture for a future reunion of all the tribes of Israel. And you'll see that as it unfolds. Now, the ancient rabbis who put together the triennial cycle of readings assigned certain prophetic passages to these Torah portions that they connected by word or by phrase or by theme, and it becomes incumbent upon us, the modern seeker, to figure out what's the connection. Now, I think that this one's pretty interesting because there is a subject that appears in both the Torah reading this week as well as the prophetic reading that makes it obvious and difficult, let's say impossible to miss, what the ancient rabbis were saying is the ultimate main point of this particular reading. What is it? There's a word, well, you don't even know what the prophet reading is, so you couldn't possibly answer that. So I'm going to tell you. Open up with me to Isaiah chapter 11. Isaiah chapter 11 and verse 2. Now, how do we know that this is the reading that's associated with this particular Torah portion? We do know this because we have ancient lists that have been recovered which tell us this, not only within rabbinic writings, but in early sermons that were recorded among Jewish scribes and so forth. So we know that Isaiah chapter 11, verse 2, and just so you know this, they generally, according to the Talmud, would read 21 verses from the prophets. I'm only going to read the first verse, but if you were going to follow the entirety of the prophetic, the Haftarah, the concluding portion from the prophets, you would read about 21 verses. So Isaiah 11:2, here it is. And the Spirit of Jehovah shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of Jehovah. this particular verse was assigned to the reading that we are going to talk about. So let me tell you this. I will let you know going into the class today that I am going to be talking today, among other things, about the Spirit of the living God. And I think that this class hopefully will help explain some of the many misconceptions that are out there, and I think it will provide us with a biblically based understanding of God's Spirit. So, that's a big, tall order, isn't it? So if you'll go with me, we are going to read, the Torah portion, and I'm going to be reading from the Transparent English Bible, the work of Dr. James Tabor, and it begins in chapter 41 of Genesis, verse 38. For those who might be new, this is a very literal translation. So you follow along in your own translation, but just recognize that. And Pharaoh said toward his servants, "Do we find like this a man in whom is the spirit of Elohim?" And Pharaoh said toward Joseph, "After Elohim has let you know all of this, there is none understanding and wise as you. You will be over my house, and upon your mouth all my people will kiss. Only in regard to the royal seat will I be large from you." And Pharaoh said toward Joseph, "See, I've given you over all the land of Egypt." And Pharaoh caused his signet ring to be turned aside from upon his hand, and he gave it upon the hand of Joseph, and dressed him in clothing of fine linen, placed a chain of gold on his neck. And he caused him to mount in the second chariot that was to him, and they called out to his face, "Avrek," and gave him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh said toward Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without you a man will not cause lifting up his hand and his foot in all the land of Egypt." Pharaoh called the name of Joseph Zaphenath Paneah, and he gave to him Asnath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, for a woman. And Joseph went out upon the land of Egypt. And Joseph was a son of 30 years and is standing before the face of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Joseph went out from the face of Pharaoh and passed over in all the land of Egypt. And the land made in the 7 years of satiety by heaps. And he gathered all the eatable things of the 7 years that was in the land of Egypt, and gave eatable things in the cities. The eatable things of the field of a city that was around it he gave in its midst. Joseph heaped up grain as sand of the sea, causing to be abundant exceedingly, until that he ceased to count, for there was no count. To Joseph were brought forth 2 sons, before the year of the hunger came, whom Asnath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, brought forth to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for Elohim has made me forget all my trouble and all the house of my father. The name of the second he called Ephraim, for Elohim has caused me to bear fruit in the land of my lowness. The 7 years of satiety were completed that were in the land of Egypt, and the 7 years of hunger began to come, as Joseph said, and hunger was in all the lands, and in all the land of Egypt was bread. And all the land of Egypt was hungry, and the people cried out toward Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Walk toward Joseph, and what he says to you, do." The hunger was upon all the face of the land, and Joseph opened all that was in them, and sold to the Egyptians in the strong, and it's actually the famine, that's a typo. And the famine, or the hunger, was strong in the land of Egypt. And all the land came to Egypt to buy toward Joseph, for the hunger was strong in all the land. And Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt. And Jacob said to his sons, "Why are you causing to look?" He said, "Look, I've heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down toward there and buy for us from there, and we live and do not die." And the 10 brothers of Joseph went down to buy grain from Egypt. And Benjamin, the brother of Joseph, Jacob did not sin with his brothers, for he said, "Lest harm meet him." The sons of Israel came to buy in the midst of those coming, for the hunger was in the land of Canaan. And Joseph He was the overlord upon that land. He was the one who was selling to all the people of the land. The brothers of Joseph came and bowed themselves down to him, 2 nostrils to the land. I like that literal. 2 nostrils, that's your face in the dirt, right? And Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, and he made himself a stranger toward them and spoke to them hard things and said toward them, "From where have you come?" And they said, "From the land of Canaan to buy eatable things." Joseph recognized his brothers, and they did not recognize him. Joseph remembered the dreams that he had dreamed of them and said toward them, "You are ones going on foot to see the nakedness of the land. You've come." And they said toward him, "No, my master, and your servants have come to buy eatable things. We are all sons of one man. We are true. Your servants are not ones going on foot." And he said toward them, "No, for the nakedness of the land you've come to see." And they said, "Your servants are 2 and 10 brothers. We are sons of one man in the land of Canaan. And look, the small one is with our father today, and one is not." Joseph said toward them, "This is what I spoke toward you, saying, one's going on foot are you. In this you will be tested. The life of Pharaoh, you will not go out from this, except indeed your brother, the small one, comes here. Send one of you, and let him take your brother, and you be bound, and let your spoken things be tested. If trustfulness is with you, and if not, by the life of Pharaoh, surely you are ones going on foot." And he gathered them toward a place of guarding for 3 days. So our boys are in trouble. Jacob's sons have a way of ending up in jail, don't they? Right? It's an embarrassment. The stage is set in this week's reading. Once Joseph, as I said, interprets Pharaoh's dreams and provides a proposal, this sets the stage for what is to come. But we can't say that the unseen hand begins only with Joseph receiving the interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams. Because if you back it up, he would never have been allowed in the presence of Pharaoh. It would have never even come up had he not interpreted the dreams of his fellow prisoners, right? So he was also given insight into that dream, which allowed that person to remember, hey, there was this Hebrew in prison with me, and he told me our dream and told the other guy his dream. He died, I lived. Now, but you can't stop there, because he would have never ended up in prison had he not been in Egypt, and he would never have ended up in Egypt had he not had 2 dreams of his own, which he told his brothers, and they hated him, and it caused them to sell him to this band of traveling spice merchants, I guess you would probably assume that they are. So you could follow this back. In other words, if you said, where does the divine intervention begin? Where is it that you can trace back and say, aha, that's the source? I'm going to be talking to you today about the source. Now, what I want to do first of all is remind everyone that all of this, being in Egypt, is central to the main storyline of the Torah. You have to have Israel in Egypt because Israel has to be rescued from Egypt, which is the one thing that God is known for. Right? How would you say, I am the Lord your God who brought you forth out of the land of Egypt, if you were never in Egypt? It's a key. It's necessary. So you got to get them to Egypt. So what we have to realize is that the patriarchs are told about, Abraham is told for sure about going to Egypt. Now, if you'll go with me to Genesis chapter 15, I just want to remind my fellow students of this very important part of the story. Genesis 15, verse 13. And Jehovah said to Abram, know of a surety Fosho, that your descendants will be sojourners. Now, by the way, he doesn't have any descendants yet. This is before he even has descendants. Well, he has Ishmael, but know of a surety that your descendants will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be slaves there, and they will be oppressed for 400 years. Imagine hearing that. But I'll bring judgment on the nation which they serve, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. As for yourself, you will go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Which I'm doing a study I won't get into today on the Amorites. Very important clue here. But that's for another day. Now, what I want to indicate is that these stories are, the narrative is carried along with the guiding of an unseen hand. That throughout these stories, if you peer past the historical element of the stories and the characters and the narrative and so forth, what you see, you and I are allowed to see the guiding of God in each of these stories. This isn't just great literature. This is great literature which tells the story of how God is guiding events. Not only in history, but in prophecy. And as you'll see, if you want to understand what's going to happen, you study what did happen. Ecclesiastes 1:9, there's nothing new under the sun. What has been is what shall be. The idea is that in order for us to see what's coming, we look at what is behind. It's not this random guessing game like some have supposed. Now, I want you to look with me to Genesis chapter 41, verse 37. Genesis 41, verse 37. Now, this is the way that the story ended last week. This proposal seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his servants. And then we stopped. Now, the question becomes, what was that proposal? And if you back up to verse 33, it tells us. He's already told him what the dream was and so forth and what it meant. He said, now, this is Joseph speaking, therefore let Pharaoh select a man, my English says, discreet and wise. Discreet and wise. And set him over the land of Egypt. So it's a pretty good plan. But in order to make the proposal work, Joseph says you have to find somebody who is discreet and wise. Now in Hebrew, we're going to be talking about the two words from which we get the English discreet and wise. A lot of times it will say understanding and wise, which is really, this is the way I interpret it, it's more of an understanding and wise. All right? You say, well, discreet can mean, okay, well, let's use my words. Understanding and wise. And what I want to talk about, first of all, is that there is more in these two words than you might know. All right? So I want you to look at chapter 41, verse 38 and 39. All right, here we go. It says this. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find such a man as this, in whom is the Spirit of God? Now I want you to just take a break here because I want you to think about this. He's been told by Joseph that he needs someone who's understanding and wise. And Pharaoh makes a little bit more of a step here because he's looking for someone with the Spirit of God in them. Okay? In them. Now, so Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is none so understanding and wise as you are. I want to tell you that I want to make a connection here between the Spirit of God indwelling and understanding and wise. Now, this is what the ancients picked up on when they associated Isaiah chapter 11 with this particular Torah portion. Now, let me tell you why, in case you missed it. It mentions the Spirit of God, and it also mentions understanding and wise. Now, I want you to go back with me to Isaiah chapter 11. Isaiah chapter 11. This is very important. If you go to Isaiah 11, and I want to read again verse 2. And the Spirit of Jehovah shall rest upon him. Notice the first phrase here. The Spirit of wisdom and understanding. All right? The Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge, and the fear of Jehovah. Now, some people count those. They come up with 7. They associate it with all sorts of things. What I'm not doing today is all of that. What I want to do is I want to associate, like these ancient teachers did, with the Spirit of the living God, and particularly the idea of understanding and wisdom. Okay? That is what the connection is. Now, if you look back at verse 38 of Genesis chapter 41, when Pharaoh makes a statement, he says, Can we find such a man as this, in whom is the Spirit of God? Now, I grew up in a different faith tradition, probably not different than you did, but I did grow up in a faith tradition that taught me. I'm not saying you learned this, but what I learned was that in the Hebrew Bible, as I was told, it was the Old Testament, that in the Old Testament, the Spirit didn't come in a person, it rested on, right? It would like touch down, whatever, but not touch down like football, but like come down and just touch, like put, like the hand of the Lord was upon me or whatever, you know, but it wasn't this indwelling. That came later is what I was taught. But in the Hebrew Bible, we don't see that. In other words, what I'm telling you is that one of the things that, well, let's just say it like this. That's false thinking. That is a misconception to say that in the Hebrew Bible, the Spirit didn't come into a person. It's just not, that's not biblical, okay? It's the same Spirit. People are people, basically. The same problems we have now are the same problems they had then. The same sins that so easily beset us, so easily beset these people. They had the same issues. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll, basically. It was the same kind of stuff. Wasn't too much different. Now, the idea, though, is that in the Hebrew Bible, the Spirit does come into a person. All right? And when people assume otherwise, it indicates to me a lack of wisdom and understanding. You get what I'm saying? In other words, for a person to say that, they lack wisdom and understanding. And then let's take it a little bit further. I would say they lack spiritual insight to say that. Okay? Maybe they're taught wrong things, maybe they don't pay attention, maybe they don't read their Bible, but that's the next step. And then perhaps maybe the harshest thing is the reason that they would teach this is because they lack the Spirit. Okay? Now, just as an example, I've got a couple of them when I was taking notes last night. because this isn't the main point of my teaching. But if you go to Ezekiel chapter 2, all right, Ezekiel chapter 2, and I just want to read a couple of verses. Go to verse 1, Ezekiel 2:1. And he said unto me, Son of man, stand upon your feet, and I will speak with you. And when he spoke to me, the Spirit entered into me and set me upon my feet, and I heard him speaking to me. Spirit entered into me, right? All right, now, look down at chapter 3. I just have these marked in my scripture. Verse 24. The Spirit entered into me and set me upon my feet, and he spoke with me and said to me, go shut yourself within your house. Spirit entered in, see? So the idea that it's that Old Testament religion, it wasn't the fullness yet. You know, they just didn't have the Spirit. Now, see, that's the mentality. And that's false. Okay, so point one, that's not true. All right, now, so let's talk about the Spirit. Now, in a way, today's class, I guess, could be, have you ever heard people talk about a full gospel? All right, so this is, and gospel just means good news, don't get nervous. This is sort of a full Torah message, right? Because it's taking this to a level that I think many people sort of tiptoe around. Because not only has another group sort of taken this idea of the Spirit of the living God coming in, you know, and they kind of got a market on this, but the other group is like, well, that's for them. Well, let me tell you something. Without the Spirit of God, none of this matters. Without the unseen hand, none of it matters. So don't be afraid to go full Torah on this, right? It's a full Torah message. In fact, you've heard of that. That came later. This is much earlier. And really what I want to do today is I want to talk about not the fruits of the Spirit, but the roots of the Spirit. That's one of the things I'm going to be talking about. So just as a couple of examples for your notes, I want you to go to Exodus, the book of Exodus, chapter 31. And we're talking about the Spirit of God, verse 1. Can you believe this is in the Torah? This is like, all right, this is the Old Testament, Dave. Exodus 31. Jehovah said unto Moses, see, I have called by name Bezalel, the son of Uri, son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah. So he's got this person selected. And I have filled him with the Spirit of God. Right? Now let's watch. With ability and intelligence, with knowledge and all craftsmanship, to devise artistic designs, to work in gold, silver, and bronze, and cutting stones for every. And he goes on and he talks about selecting a Holiav as well. Now, let me tell you something. If you're going to do a work for Jehovah, you have to be filled with the Spirit. And not only do you need to be, God is going to make sure you are, because He's going to call that person and He's going to fill them and enable them to do whatever it is that they need to do. If it's making tapestries or, whatever. I think that people sort of have this other idea that it involves, doing all kind of miracles that, people like to see. But what we're talking about is the true indwelling of God's Spirit, which is going to do one thing for sure. It's going to advance the kingdom of God. It's going to accomplish the things that God needs done. You need a tabernacle, a house of prayer for all nations. He's going to fill somebody with His Spirit, with wisdom and understanding and knowledge and so forth. Everything they need is going to be part of this deal. You're going to be equipped. Now, look down at verse, let's go to chapter 35. 35, beginning in verse 30. Moses said to the people of Israel, 35:30, See, Jehovah is called by name Betzalel, the son of Uri, son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, and he has filled him with the Spirit of God, with ability, with intelligence, with knowledge, with all craftsmanship to devise artistic designs. And he goes through and he covers all these wonderful things. Look at verse 35. He has filled them with ability to do every sort of work done by a craftsman or by a designer or by an embroiderer, it's a tough word, in blue and purple and scarlet stuff and fine twined linen, or by a weaver, by any sort of workman or skilled designer. Betzalel and Holiav and every able man in whom Jehovah has put ability and intelligence to know how to do any work in the construction of the sanctuary shall work in accordance with all that Jehovah has commanded. And these words in Hebrew, the translations vary. What we're talking about, again, if you look at the Hebrew, it's wisdom and understanding. It's wisdom, chacham, and understanding, binah. Now, they're translated variously, but this is what God is. He's putting His Spirit in them. And what does that look like? We just read it. Okay? What these do, whenever you see wisdom and understanding associated with things of God, you're talking about the Spirit. All right? That's just biblically a fact. What it indicates to me, it's indicative of the divine realm entering into the human realm in a very, very real way. It's enabling. Now, here's a question for you. Do you, or better, should we be surprised that a foreigner takes note of this? Right? Because you go, well, it wasn't like Joseph said, well, Pharaoh, the reason I can help you here is I'm filled with the Spirit of God. I'm a full Torah, Hebrew, and watch me do tricks. I mean, none of that stuff comes. He doesn't advertise on the sign out front that he is a Spirit-filled Hebrew, right? Which is what a lot of people, right? Get that. But what Joseph does is he operates in the power that the Creator has given him without fanfare, without seeking credit. When they try to give Joseph credit, what does he do? He says, no, it's not me, it's God. So I think that these are all clues as to how you tell the real from the fake. Because they got a lot of fake. The Torah's full of that too. They got fake magicians turning sticks into snakes, and they got all kind of stuff. They were duplicating miracles, and they're going to have. Look, Deuteronomy 13 says even if they perform these miracles, don't look. If they're trying to get you to follow another god, I'm trying to show you that what's happening to me is as I look around any given town, any given state, any given country, there are all these false religious systems who may or may not be meaning the right, have the right intentions, but if you have that false worship associated, beware, okay? So, but the question is, should we be surprised that Pharaoh, an Egyptian, takes note that Joseph has the Spirit of God? No. No, in fact, it's going to happen that way. Look with me at Deuteronomy chapter 5. Deuteronomy chapter 5. I'm sorry, Deuteronomy 4, verse 5. Deuteronomy 4, verse 5. Behold, I have taught you statutes and ordinances as Jehovah my God commanded me, that you should do them in the land which you are entering to take possession of it. Keep them, which is in Hebrew, guard them and do them, for that will be your, get this, wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the people, who when they hear all these statutes will say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as Jehovah our God is whenever we call upon him? And what great nation is there that has statutes and ordinances so righteous as all this Torah which I set before you this day? Now here's a question for you. Did you see the emphasis on this will be your wisdom and your understanding in the eyes of the peoples? This is talking about non-Israelites. What will be your wisdom and understanding? What will be your wisdom and your understanding is your keeping and guarding and doing the Torah. Now, I've already shown that wisdom and understanding are associated with an indwelling of God's Spirit, which makes me wonder, could there be an association between doing the works of Torah and experiencing the Spirit of God indwelling in the life of believers? I think there is. And I would ask, who has bewitched us into thinking something differently? Look, if you and I are not willing to walk in accordance with God's ways, do we invite the presence of the living God to dwell within us while we entertain sinful things? No. The answer to that is no, in case you're wondering. No, we don't. We shouldn't. We should be, now this sounds sort, this may, people are like, is this a Hebrew Bible class? Listen, what if we really were in some ways, go to Exodus. Let's just do it this way. Exodus chapter 25, verse 8. 25, verse 8. And let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell in their midst, according to all that I've shown you in the mount. Now, here's what people assume that is. You have a sanctuary, a holy place, and God's going to be right in the middle of it. But what if he's saying he wants to dwell in the midst of his people? You know how many times it says that in the Hebrew Bible? So this idea is when we talk about what we experience, when we look at, for instance, in the book of Ezekiel, as he tells Ezekiel, stand upon your feet, and the Spirit entered into me. All right. I believe that there is an association between doing and guarding and keeping the way and having God's Spirit present. You can't convince me otherwise. If you're choosing to live a life that is counter to God's ways of life, don't think for 1 minute that God's going to be present. In fact, it says in Proverbs 28:9 that if you don't incline your ear towards the Torah, even your prayer is an abomination. I mean, hey, that's what it says. So, now there's a little bit more on the subject. Look at 1 Kings. Look at 1 Kings chapter 4. 1 Kings 4, verse 29. Now, if you're following along in a Hebrew Bible, it begins in chapter 5, verse 9. But in the English Bible, it's 1 Kings 4, 29. Hebrew Bible, 1 Kings 5, 9. And God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure. So I have in my footnote, he had the Spirit without limit. And largeness of mind like the sand on the seashore, so that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the East, and all the wisdom of Egypt, for he was wiser than all men, wiser than old Ethan the Ezrahite, and Haman, and Chalcol, and Darda, the sons of Machol. And his fame was in all the nations round about. He also uttered 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. He spoke of trees, from the cedar that's in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the wall. He spoke also of beasts, and of birds, and of reptiles, and of fish. And men came from all people to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. Where'd that wisdom come from? Wisdom and understanding were given to Solomon by Hashem. He had the Spirit. Now, does that mean he didn't sin? No. I mean, read the story of Solomon. I mean, he had problems, right? He chose those. He chose to go against the instructions that he knew brought life. Now, you know where it says that he was wiser than all? It reminds me, it should bring us back to this idea in Genesis 41, verse 39, where it says Daniel was the wisest of all. See, Daniel had that spirit as well. See, that's what makes the difference. Now, did I say Daniel? I said Daniel because I'm going to Daniel. I meant Joseph. But now we're going to Daniel. Go to Daniel chapter 1. Daniel chapter 1. Daniel 1, verse 4. Just want to drill this point home. 1:4. Youths without blemish, handsome and skillful, in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to serve in the king's palace. So this is what this other pagan ruler, this Babylonian's looking for. He's looking for among the captives to find somebody who's got, among other things, wisdom and understanding. Now look down at verse 17, please. As for these four youths, we're talking about Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. These four youths, verse 17, God gave them learning and skill in all letters and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. These are, you almost could say, supernatural powers. We're not talking about someone just, he's smart. It's a different level. We're not talking about someone who read well and was fluent in languages. This is God-given wisdom and understanding. That's what we're talking about here. Look at chapter 2, verse 20. Let's see. 2. Where is it? Okay, Daniel said, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise, knowledge to those who have understanding." You see this idea. It's this repetition of the phrase wisdom and understanding. There is another passage while we're right here. Just go ahead and look at chapter 5 of Daniel, verse 11. You know this story as well. "There is in your kingdom a man in whom is the spirit of the holy gods." See, these pagans recognize this. How did they recognize it? Well, they know that this wisdom is incomparable. There's nothing like it in all their kingdom. "In those days, in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him." See that? Now, if you go down up to verse 14, "I have heard of you, that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and that light and understanding," and so forth. He goes on and on and on. "I've heard that you can give interpretations," and he tries to give him awards, and Daniel says, "Let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another." Verse 17, "Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation." You see the difference? You see how these people are They're humble with it, but they have incomparable wisdom and knowledge. Now, there are quite a few other passages, from Psalm 111 and Proverbs 9:10. We know that the fear of Jehovah is the beginning of this. So I would tell you that if one wanted to somehow be blessed with the Spirit of God within them, it begins with the fear of Jehovah, right? The fear of Jehovah is the beginning of this. You can't, if you don't fear Jehovah in awesome reverence, forget the rest. You've heard of, as I stated earlier, the fruits of the Spirit. What I'm talking about they go much deeper. They're the roots of the Spirit. They're based in the Hebrew Bible, and they're spoken of in many, many ways and many occasions. For instance, that they work in heaven and on earth. The same roots work in heaven and on earth, which makes me think that without these, you cannot plant the kingdom of God on earth. Isaiah 51:16, Isaiah 51:12 and 51:16 talks about planting heaven. Well, let me tell you something. The only way that you can plant heaven is by finding those seeds which work in both realms. Let your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. It's not an object that you're going to heaven. No, you're not. You're here. See, you bring heaven here. And we can do that. Now, let me show you something. What are those roots of the Spirit which work in both the heavenly realm and on earth? Okay, watch this. Go with me to the book of Proverbs. Proverbs, chapter 3, verse 19. Jehovah by wisdom founded the earth, by understanding he established the heavens. By his knowledge the deeps broke forth and the clouds dropped down the dew. Wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. You see what I'm saying? These three things, you talk about elements, these three elements are integral to the creation. Wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. By the way, speaking of Chabad, that's where they get that. The name Chabad is based on three Hebrew words. Chokhmah, all right, Binah, which is, Chokhmah is wisdom, Binah is understanding, and Da'at is knowledge. Chabad, that's where they get that name. Now, go with me now to Proverbs 24. Proverbs 24, verse 3. By wisdom a house is built, by understanding it is established, by knowledge the rooms are filled with all precious and pleasant riches. The idea is that these elements can work not only to establish the heavens and the earth, but to establish a home. Right? We have to be wise and understanding and knowledgeable to be parents and spouses and siblings, and these things are very necessary. Okay. Now, that was just to sort of establish the connection that the ancient rabbis made with these particular stories that we're reading about. So we're going to quickly go through the Torah reading, just picking up on a few high points that I think are important in today's reading. Pharaoh realizes that Joseph is filled with the Spirit of the living God. He gets that. He sees it. We've already said that according to Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, that's been the plan all along. That the nations of the world will look at you and say, what a wise and understanding people this is. Meaning, this is a Spirit-filled group, right? If you'll allow me to make that connection. Just like Daniel later, he is also in a place that's second only to Pharaoh. There's no one. In fact, it says very clearly, you're over all the land of Egypt, is what he's told by Pharaoh. right? The Lord of the dreams has become the Lord of the land. Very interesting. Sort of a turn of events that might not have been seen in the home of Jacob many years earlier. But remember, after Jacob heard the dream, he's been keeping an eye on things. So he's aware that something is different about him. Now, one of the things that I like to point out in the Joseph saga is once again Joseph changes his garments. He's given a change of clothes. Remember, anytime Joseph changes clothes or the garments are involved, it's significant in the Joseph saga. All right? So he gets now, I think for the first time, he's dressed as an Egyptian. Okay? For all intents and purposes, the Hebrew has become absorbed by the culture around him. He is in a chariot that when it rides through the town, the people fall down and they say, Avrek. And people debate the meaning of this. Many find an association between this Egyptian loan word, evidently, Avrek, and Barak in Hebrew, which means to kneel. It's come to be associated with the word bless. But the root meaning is to take a knee. So the idea is that the people, when they see Joseph riding through in the chariot, they hit the ground, right? And they shout out. Joseph gets this pagan woman, at least a non-Israelite priest daughter, just like Moses. Now, there are traditions which can't stand this, because there is a tradition that says in order to be part of the covenant people, your mama has to be from the covenant people. So this presents a problem. See, we can't have an Egyptian girl, straight up Egyptian, named Asnat, the daughter of the priest of On, having children that are supposed to be Israelites, because that presents a problem with later tradition. So we say, there are some traditions that say, well, you know, she was a good Hebrew girl on her mama's side, you know, and they trace all this down. And I'm not trying to make fun, but I'm being serious. When you look at the scripture, it doesn't say any of that. It's very, very clear that this woman that he takes, not only is she not Hebrew, she's connected to the priest of On. Right? Now, I know there are counters to this, but do your own research. Think about that. Moses marries a Cushite. Moses also marries this girl named Zipporah, right? She is the daughter of a priest of Midian. And people do some changing around on that story too. The idea is that, look, God can work through and does work through many, many people. I mean, he can take a harlot in Jericho and change the course of history in several ways. So let's be careful and not worry so much about those kind of things. What we find is that in our narrative today, that Joseph is 30 years of age. Joseph being 30 years of age, he comes into this position, which means it's 13 years out from when he left Jacob. It's been 13 years. And lots happened in 13 years. He's been to jail a couple of times. He's had people make allegations against him. He's been up. He's been down. It's been a long roller coaster of 13 years. Now, the thing that's interesting to me is that he has now successfully guided the children of Egypt, the people of Egypt, through the 7 years of plenty. And right before the famine, he has a couple of boys with Asnat. He names the boys Manasseh and Ephraim. Now, it's interesting that as he is now an Egyptian, right? Anybody that saw him would say, oh, it's an Egyptian man. He has these two kids, and he names them. Manasseh is associated with forgetfulness. Like this now, because of what's going on, I have forgotten my father's house. I've forgotten, see? It's all out of my mind now. And the troubles, yeah. I've forgotten all that. It's all behind me now. It's forgotten. And I'm fruitful. So his kids are basically like you'd call them into dinner. You'd go, forgetful, fruitful, come on. I mean, really, that's their names. Now, here's something that I want you to understand. Prophetically, I believe that Joseph's sons are both forgetful and fruitful. They've forgotten their father's house. They've forgotten all the troubles. They've forgotten their sins. They've forgotten where they came from. They've forgotten their fold, as the prophet Jeremiah says. Joseph has forgotten, and nonetheless, he's fruitful. We'll talk even more about that in coming classes. He's told, the people are told when they go to Pharaoh, we need food. He says, go to Joseph. He'll tell you what to do. Whatever he tells you to do, do it. Go to Joseph. Joseph is the man. There's global hunger. Then we read in chapter 42, verse 1, it says that Jacob sees that there's food in Egypt. How does he see there's food in Egypt? That's a long distance. I mean, Dave and I, even at Eilat, it's a stretch to see food in Egypt. So some have argued that this is prophetic. He envisions. Now, the word is tied to the root ra'ah, which is just to see, like with your eyes. It's generally not the word that's associated with visionary sight, but it could be. And I could be making more of it than it says, because a couple of verses later he says to his boys, what are you standing here looking at each other for? I've heard that there's grain in Egypt. The idea is that it becomes knowledge in the world. If you want to survive, you got to go to Egypt. They got this Egyptian down there. His name is Zaphanat Paneah, and you go to him and you get food. So all but Benjamin go. They all go down there. Now, it says they go down. Now, they really do go down. If you look at the map, they're going to go down. And it's interesting that once again, when I see this going down mentioned in these Torah stories associated with Egypt and the patriarchs, Joseph was taken down. He didn't go on his own. Judah, in chapter 38, went down, right? Not to Egypt, but that's the name. And now, 10 of the boys go down to Egypt to find food. In chapter 42, verse 5, for the first time, the children of Israel are called the children of Israel. They've been called the sons of Jacob. Generally, when we see sons of Israel, the children of Israel in this configuration, Bnei Israel, it deals with the nation. And so some have looked at this and said, it's interesting because this is speaking at a deeper level of the nation. Some 350 times in Scripture, Bnei Israel deals with the nation, not like the boys, the sons of Jacob. It deals with the people in a bigger sense. So, look at chapter 42 of Genesis. Genesis 42, verse 6. And Joseph was governor over the land. He it was who sold all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. And Joseph saw his brothers and knew them. He treated them like strangers and spoke roughly to them. Where do you come from, he said. They said, from the land of Canaan to buy food. But thus Joseph knew his brothers, but they did not know him. And Joseph remembered the dreams which he had dreamed of them, and he said to them, you're spies. You've come to see the weakness of the land. Interesting that in this meeting with all the boys except Benjamin, the brothers come in, face to the ground. And it says that he was a stranger to them. He made, literally in the Hebrew, he made himself a stranger to them. Now, there are a lot of people today who believe that they are, in fact, Joseph, that they are members of the lost tribe. You have people that say, oh, there's no way you can prove that. You're so stupid. Just, and there's a lot of criticism. There's a lot of bickering and fighting. Here's something I would tell you. What Joseph does here is probably a clue as to the way the people who believe that they might be Joseph right now, here's a clue for you. Be a stranger right now. Just for right now. Stick with me on this. We're going to go into this in a couple more classes. But it says that he made himself a stranger. It says, they look at him, does he immediately go, oh man, let me get this eye makeup off. It's me, it's Joseph, I'm your brother, look at me. He didn't do that. He remained unrecognizable to them. And I think that's significant. Enough on that point. But he remembers his dreams. Now you remember in chapter 37, verses 5 through 9, he has two dreams. And let's look real quickly at that, chapter 37, because they're very important. Now you look at it and you go, chapter 37, verse 5, Joseph had a dream. And when he told it to his brothers, they only hated him the more. And he said to them, hear this dream which I've dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field. Notice it has to do with food. And lo, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. What you think that means, boys? Right? So you remember we covered it. Now, then he has another dream about the stars and so forth, and the same picture. I'm exalted, you're not. When I look at this, now it says Joseph remembered his dream. Right before it said Joseph had called his kids forgotten and fruitful. Now all of a sudden he remembers his dreams. Can you imagine the feeling? Now he's restraining it. We'll read later about that emotion bubbling up, but right now he's able to hold it back. In fact, he calls them spies. He's very critical of them. Joseph, they jump back in verse 10, chapter 42, verse 10. They jump back and say, no, my Lord, we came to buy food. Your servants have come. We are all sons of one man. We are honest men. Your servants are not spies. And then he interjects. Joseph cuts him off. No, it's the weakness of the land that you've come to see. And they go, no. We are your servants and 12 brothers, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. And behold, the youngest is with this day with our father, and one is no more. Guess who's no more? Can you imagine hearing that? I imagine there's a little distance between them, and they're humbled, and they're trying to convince him that they're not there to spy out the land, because that could be very bad. Verse 13, again, we, your servants, are 12 brothers, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan, and behold, the youngest is this day with our father, and one is no more. I want to talk to you as I close about this. Benjamin and Joseph are not there, in a sense, among the brothers. Joseph is there, but he's not among the brothers. You get what I'm saying? There's 10 of them. Now I want you to go with me to Jeremiah 31, because I want to show you something prophetic. Jeremiah 31, verse 15. Thus says Jehovah, voices heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping. Rachel is weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted for her children because they are not. Now, why is Rachel weeping? Rachel is weeping because whatever it is in this prophetic vision that she sees, her sons aren't there. She doesn't see her sons. Like if you were looking out over a ballpark and you're looking for your kids, you get panicked. You're like, I don't see my kids. Where are my kids? Where are my kids? she looks out in this vision. This is a vision of her having a vision, and she's crying. Why are you crying, Rachel? She's crying because her children are not. And then in Hebrew it says, children are not, and then it says, for he is not, like one son. Another question. Why is the weeping heard at Ramah? Right? According to Genesis 35, she's buried on the way towards Ephrat, to Bethlehem. She's buried there at Genesis 35, right? You can read it for yourself. Now, if you read 1 Samuel chapter 10, it seems to indicate that it's on the road to Ramah. So you got to look at these. 1 Samuel 10:2. I'm not going to go into it now. We'll probably do it in the dialogue, but I want to make a point here. So from Ramah, you hear a voice weeping. Why, though? Why is she heard weeping at Ramah? And what does that have to do with her sons missing? Go to Jeremiah chapter 40. Jeremiah chapter 40. The word that came to Jeremiah from Jehovah after Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, had let him go from Ramah, when he took him bound in chains along with all the captives of Jerusalem and Judah who were being exiled to Babylon. Here's an idea for you. One of the things that we know from history is that the point before deportation for Israel, right, is at Ramah. Now, imagine as a mother witnessing your children going into exile. Now you go, well, this is the kingdom of Judah and so forth and so on. But the idea, though, that Ramah is associated with going into exile, I think is significant. She's weeping because her children are not. Our story ends this way. The scene is set for what follows, both historically, like when you read the story, and prophetically. So here's the stage being set for our next class. Here it is. Joseph recognized his brothers, but they didn't recognize him. They're all sons of the same father. Joseph and Benjamin are not, or so it's believed. But as far as the company of the brothers, they're not with them. They're not associated at this point. But behind the scenes, and get this, please, the Spirit of the living God is working in Joseph to bring about a restoration of the family. Get that. The Spirit of the living God is in Joseph to bring about the greatest restoration that the world has ever seen. But he can't rush things. He can't reveal who he is to his brothers at this point, and he doesn't. The same Spirit that created the world, the same Spirit which indwelled Joseph of old, can indwell those today who are being set apart for a special task. History and prophecy are the same. Shabbat Shalom. So we'll take a few minutes and we'll post a link for the dialogue. Stay with us.